The thunderous drumbeat of hoofbeats echoed across the Nevada wasteland, growing closer with each passing second. Clara Harper's bare feet pounded against the scorched earth, her lungs burning as she clutched her 5-year-old son Tommy against her chest. The child's fever-racked body had grown heavy during their 3-day flight from Widow's Peak. But she couldn't stop not when Shaw's riders were so close she could smell the dust kicked up by their horses. A weathered ranch house materialized through the heat shimmer ahead, its wooden porch offering the promise of sanctuary. Clara's legs trembled with exhaustion as the hoofbeats behind her grew deafening. She stumbled the final yards, her knees crashing onto the sun-bleached boards of the porch, just as the sound of pursuit seemed to fill the entire desert. "Help!" She screamed, her voice cracking with terror as she pounded her fist against the wooden planks. Through a gap beneath the door, she glimpsed a tall shadow moving inside. "Please, somebody, they're going to kill us." Tommy stirred weakly in her arms, his small hand reaching up to touch her tear-streaked face. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Shh, baby." Clara gasped, pressing her ear to the door. The hoofbeats were fading now. Shaw's men must have lost their trail in the rocky terrain, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. "We're going to be safe, I promise." The door creaked open with agonizing slowness, revealing a man whose steel-gray eyes held the wariness of someone who'd survived too many betrayals. Elijah Ford stood silhouetted against the dim interior, his hand resting casually on the grip of his Colt .45. He studied the collapsed woman and feverish child with calculating precision, his gaze already sweeping the horizon for signs of trouble. "Who's hunting you?" His voice carried the flat authority of a man accustomed to violence. "Shaw's gang," Clara whispered, clutching Tommy protectively. "From Widow's Peak. They want to silence me." Something flickered in Elijah's expression at the mention of Shaw's name. A flash of recognition, or perhaps old hatred. "What did you see?" Clara's throat constricted. "Murder, made to look like an accident. I'm the only witness." For a long moment, Elijah said nothing. Then he stepped aside with reluctant precision. "Storage shed behind the house. Keep quiet, stay hidden. You bring trouble to my doorstep, you'll answer for it personally." "I can work," Clara said frantically, reading dismissal in his posture. "Cook, clean, tend livestock, anything you need, just until my boy recovers." "The shed," Elijah repeated coldly. "Nothing more." As Clara hurried toward the ramshackle structure behind the main house, she caught sight of Elijah's profile and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. His face was scarred and weathered, marked by the kind of violence that left permanent shadows. She'd hoped to find safety, but she was beginning to suspect she'd simply traded one form of captivity for another. The mining town of Widow's Peak had promised a fresh start when Clara arrived 5 years earlier as Daniel Harper's bride. She'd buried her past, deep becoming someone new, no longer Clara Landry, daughter of the ruthless mining magnate Marcus Landry, but simply Clara Harper, building a humble life far from her father's blood-soaked empire. Their small house had echoed with Tommy's laughter, while Daniel worked the copper mines with honest sweat. Clara had thought she'd finally escaped the corruption that defined her childhood, but the past had a way of catching up no matter how far she ran. The day everything shattered began like any other. Clara was delivering Daniel's lunch to the mine when she overheard a conversation that would destroy her world. Hidden behind a supply wagon, she listened as the mine foreman spoke in hushed tones, with Cullen Shaw, her father's most ruthless enforcer. "On Landry's breathing down my neck about costs," the foreman muttered nervously. "Says we're using too much quality timber, taking too long with safety inspections." Shaw's laugh was cold as winter steel. "Then we give the old man what he wants. Cheaper materials, faster extraction. If something goes wrong, we blame geological instability. But the men don't matter." Shaw cut him off. "Profit does. Landry's paying me well to make sure this operation stays profitable, and that's exactly what I intend to do." Horror washed over Clara as she realized what she was hearing. Her father, whose cruelty she'd fled years earlier, was now cutting corners that would endanger innocent lives, like her husband's. And Shaw, his most vicious lieutenant, was implementing those deadly policies with callous efficiency. 3 days later, the mine collapse claimed 14 lives, including Daniel's. The official report blamed unstable rock formations, but Clara knew the truth. It was murder disguised as industrial accident, orchestrated by her own father's greed. Shaw had made his position crystal clear at Daniel's funeral, approaching Clara with mock sympathy while his men watched from nearby. Tragic loss, he'd said, his eyes holding the cold promise of violence. Of course, widows sometimes get confused ideas about what caused their grief. Start spreading wild stories that could damage important men's reputations. His meaning was unmistakable. Clara could work for Shaw at his saloon, keeping her mouth shut about what she'd overheard, or face the consequences of defying the most dangerous man in 3 counties. For months, she'd endured his leering surveillance, while secretly planning escape, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The thunderstorm that finally provided cover for their flight had seemed like salvation until Shaw's riders picked up their trail and began the relentless pursuit that had brought her to Elijah Ford's doorstep. The storage shed offered little comfort beyond basic shelter. Clara made a bed for Tommy using moth-eaten horse blankets, using her own shawl as a pillow, while she monitored his labored breathing. The fever that had gripped him during their flight showed no signs of breaking, and she had no medicine, no way to ease his suffering. As darkness fell, she became acutely aware of their vulnerability. The shed had no lock, no defense against intruders. Every sound made her nerves jump, wind rattling loose boards, coyotes howling in the distance. And most unnerving of all, Elijah's boots moving around the main house with military precision. Near midnight, she heard approaching footsteps and pressed herself against the wall, clutching a splintered board as a makeshift weapon. But the steps passed without stopping, and through a gap in the planks, she glimpsed Elijah patrolling his property, with a rifle moving like a ghost through the moonlight. Dawn brought coarse bread and jerky left outside the shed door, meager fare, but Clara devoured it gratefully while feeding Tommy small bites. As she ventured to the well for water, she caught sight of the main house's interior through an open window and froze in shock. The walls were covered with an arsenal that could equip a small army rifle's pistols, knives, even a cavalry saber mounted above the fireplace. But what made her blood run cold were the sketches pinned to one wall, detailed drawings of men's faces, most crossed out in red ink. It looked like a hunter's trophy collection, except the quarry was human. One face in particular caught her attention, a sketch that looked remarkably similar to Shaw, though it hadn't been crossed out yet. Clara stared at it with growing unease, wondering what connection her reluctant protector might have to the man hunting them. That afternoon brought the visitors she'd been dreading. The sound of hoofbeats made Clara's heart hammer as she peered through gaps in the shed walls to see 3 of Shaw's men dismounting near the house. She recognized Pike immediately, Shaw's most vicious lieutenant, a scarred brute who took pleasure in inflicting pain. Looking for a woman and boy. Pike called out, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Thought you might have seen them pass through?" Elijah emerged from the house with deceptive calm, though Clara noticed how he positioned himself for quick access to cover. "This is private land. Wasn't asking about your property rights." Pike growled, studying Elijah with predatory interest. Asked a simple question. "You seen a woman and boy or not?" "I see lots of things. Don't make it your concern." Pike's eyes narrowed as he assessed the rancher. Something in Elijah's bearing, the way he stood balanced on the balls of his feet, hand loose near his weapon, suggested he was far more dangerous than he appeared. A man who'd survived alone in this hostile territory had to be either very lucky or very deadly, and Pike wasn't eager to test which. "We'll be back," Pike finally said, swinging back into his saddle. Next time we'll bring more friends. Lots more. After the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust, Elijah approached the shed. Clara was trembling, still clutching Tommy protectively against her chest. "Those your hunters?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Elijah studied her face for a long moment, then glanced toward the horizon, where dust still marked the riders' passage. "Then you'd better hope I decide you're worth the trouble they're planning to bring." Over the following days, Clara threw herself into work around the ranch with desperate determination. She repaired broken fencing that had been neglected for months, tended Elijah's small herd of cattle, and cleaned equipment that hadn't seen proper maintenance in years. The labor was backbreaking under the punishing sun, but she welcomed the exhaustion that temporarily dulled her constant fear. Elijah observed her efforts from a distance, never speaking, unless absolutely necessary. Clara began noticing disturbing details about her reluctant host. He never slept more than a few hours at a time, always kept multiple weapons within reach, and moved with the controlled precision of someone expecting attack at any moment. During brief conversations while she worked, Clara tried to learn more about the mysterious rancher. "Have you lived here long?" she asked one evening as she helped him repair a water trough. "Long enough," came the terse reply. "Must get lonely out here by yourself." Elijah's hand stilled on the wood he was working. Solitude has its advantages. Still, it's no life for a man. "Don't you ever think about having a family again?" The look Elijah gave her was so full of anguish that Clara immediately regretted the question. "Some things can't be replaced," he said quietly, then walked away without another word. Tommy's fever finally broke on the third day, and the boy began showing interest in his surroundings. His natural curiosity seemed to puzzle Elijah, who watched the child with an expression Clara couldn't decipher, not hostile, but certainly not welcoming either. "Why doesn't the man like us, Mama?" Tommy asked one evening as they shared their meager dinner in the shed. "Some folks take time to warm up to strangers, sweetheart." Clara replied, though she suspected Elijah might be incapable of warmth toward anyone. "He's probably just not used to having children around. Papa always said everyone's got goodness inside if you look hard enough." Clara's throat tightened at the mention of Daniel. "Your papa was a wise man, baby. We just have to be patient." Curiously, she noticed that when Tommy would venture near the main house, carefully supervised by Clara, Elijah's harsh expression would soften almost imperceptibly. Once she caught him watching the boy play with a carved wooden horse he'd found, and there was something almost wistful in the rancher's eyes. "How old is he?" Elijah asked unexpectedly one afternoon. "5, Clara replied. "He'll be 6 come winter." Elijah nodded slowly, then disappeared into the house without explanation. That evening, Clara found a small wooden cup, carved with simple designs outside the shed door, clearly made for small hands. When she thanked him, Elijah merely grunted and walked away, but she caught the ghost of a smile on his weathered face. On the 4th night, Clara's worst nightmares materialized. The thunder of many hoofbeats jolted her awake, and through gaps in the shed walls, she counted at least a dozen riders surrounding the ranch house. Shaw had brought his entire gang this time. Ford. Shaw's voice boomed across the darkness. "I know you're harboring that woman and boy. Send them out, and maybe I'll let you live." Clara clutched Tommy against her chest, mind racing with desperation. They could try fleeing into the desert darkness, but Tommy was still weak from his fever, and they wouldn't survive long on foot in the hostile wasteland. Their only hope lay with Elijah, and she had no reason to expect mercy from a man who collected human trophies. The distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the night air. "This is my land." Elijah called back, his voice steady as bedrock. "Anyone who doesn't belong here has 10 seconds to clear out before I start shooting." Shaw's laughter was harsh and mocking. "You're outnumbered 12-1, Ford. Don't be a fool. Then you'd better make sure your first shot kills me." Elijah replied with chilling calm, "Because I guarantee my first shot will kill one of you." The gunfight that erupted transformed the peaceful night into hellish chaos. Muzzle flashes strobed like lightning as Shaw's men opened fire from multiple positions, their bullets shattering every window in the house and splintering the wooden walls. Clara pressed Tommy to the floor of the shed, shielding him with her body as stray rounds punched through the thin planks around them. From her hiding place, she could see Elijah moving between windows with deadly efficiency. He seemed to anticipate each attack appearing at unexpected positions to return fire with surgical precision. His first shot dropped one of Shaw's men from his horse with a scream that cut through the night. His second and third shots sent the remaining riders scrambling for better cover, but Clara recognized this as merely a probing attack. Shaw was testing Elijah's defenses, learning the ranch's layout and gauging his opponent's capabilities. When the shooting finally stopped and the surviving riders retreated to regroup, she knew they would return with a more devastating strategy. Elijah appeared at the shed door, his face grim in the moonlight. Blood trickled from a graze on his temple, where a bullet had come uncomfortably close. "We need to talk," he said tersely. Clara followed him to the main house, carrying Tommy in her arms. The interior resembled a battlefield, bullet holes spider-webbing the walls, furniture overturned for cover, broken glass glittering everywhere. Elijah methodically cleaned and reloaded his weapons with the mechanical precision of a veteran soldier. "Tell me everything," he said without looking up from the rifle he was examining. "Why Shaw wants you dead badly enough to risk this many men." Clara told him the complete truth about Daniel's death in the mine collapse, about the conversation she'd overheard between Shaw and the foreman, about her father's involvement in cutting safety costs to maximize profits. As she spoke, she noticed Elijah's expression growing increasingly dark. "You're not just running from Shaw," he said when she finished. "You're the key to exposing his entire operation. That's why he can't let you escape alive. I just want to keep my son safe." Clara whispered, her voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "Then you made a poor choice of sanctuary." Elijah replied bluntly. "Shaw won't give up. He'll bring more men next time, and he'll keep coming until one of us is dead." Clara felt tears burning her eyes. "I'm sorry. I never meant to bring this trouble to your door. If you want us to leave..." "No." The word came out harder than Elijah seemed to intend. He looked at Tommy, who was sleeping fitfully on a makeshift bed, and then back at Clara. "Maybe it's time someone stood up to Shaw's kind. Maybe it's been time for a long while." As Clara settled Tommy into the relative safety of the main house. Elijah had insisted they'd be better protected there. During the next assault, she noticed something that made her stomach clench with unease. In the lamplight, she could see that several of the crossed-out faces on Elijah's wall looked familiar. She'd seen them on wanted posters in Widow's Peak. Her reluctant protector wasn't just a rancher living in isolation, he was a killer, and judging by his trophy collection, he was extremely proficient at it. She was trapped between two dangerous men, and she was beginning to wonder which one posed the greater threat to her and Tommy's survival. The second attack came with the false dawn catching them, as Clara prepared a meager breakfast from Elijah's dwindling supplies. This time, Shaw's men came in complete silence, spreading out to surround the house, before opening fire from all directions simultaneously. Clara grabbed Tommy and dove behind an overturned table as bullets shattered every remaining window in the house. The cacophony was overwhelming, the constant thunder of gunfire, the crash of splintering wood, the whine of ricochets off metal fixtures. Elijah moved through the chaos like a specter appearing at different windows to return fire, making it seem like multiple defenders instead of one embattled man. But Clara could see they were being systematically overwhelmed. Shaw had brought at least 20 men this time, and they were methodically destroying the house room by room. Burning torches sailed through broken windows, setting the wooden floors ablaze and filling the interior with choking smoke. During a brief lull in the gunfire, Shaw's men were likely reloading. Clara heard stealthy footsteps approaching the back of the house. One of the attackers was trying to flank them, moving through the smoke to catch them by surprise. As the intruder appeared in the kitchen doorway, Clara acted on pure maternal instinct. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all her strength, catching the man across the temple with a sickening crack. He collapsed unconscious, his rifle clattering across the floor. "Behind you!" She screamed to Elijah, who spun and put 2 bullets into another attacker trying to climb through a rear window. But even working together, they couldn't hold off so many determined assailants. The fire was spreading rapidly now, thick black smoke making it difficult to breathe. Tommy was coughing violently, his small body struggling with the toxic air. In the confusion of smoke and gunfire, Clara's precious locket, her last connection to the past, was torn from her neck by flying debris. She watched in horror as it skittered across the burning floor. The chain snapped, the gold case dented and blackened. Without thinking, she crawled toward it desperately. Inside was the only photograph she possessed of her childhood, herself standing beside her father, before she understood what kind of monster he truly was. It represented everything she'd tried to escape, but it was also the last tangible link to her identity. Her fingers closed around the warm metal just as Elijah appeared, dragging her away from the spreading flames. In her haste, the locket popped open, and the small photograph fluttered to the floor like a dying bird. Elijah's eyes fell on the image, and Clara watched his face transform completely. The cold mask he always wore shattered, replaced by an expression of pure, murderous rage. His hands began shaking as he picked up the photograph, staring at the image of young Clara beside Marcus Landry. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely human, more growl than speech. It's my father." Clara stammered, confused by his violent reaction. "From when I was little. Why, Marcus Landry is your father." The words emerged like a curse torn from his throat. Clara nodded, still not comprehending the magnitude of what she'd revealed. She'd told no one in Widow's Peak about her origins, creating an entirely new identity when she married Daniel. "You're his daughter." Elijah's gun materialized in his hand, aimed directly at her heart. His face was twisted with hatred so pure it was terrifying to witness. "The daughter of the man who murdered my entire family." The words hit Clara like physical blows. She stared at Elijah in shock as horrible understanding began to dawn, pieces of a nightmare puzzle clicking into place. 10 years ago. Elijah continued, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Your father decided he wanted the land my family had owned for 3 generations. We had water rights, mineral deposits, things that would make his mining operation more profitable. When we refused to sell, he hired men to take it by force." Clara felt the world spinning around her as the full magnitude of the revelation sank in. "They came at night just like Shaw's men tonight." Elijah whispered, his eyes haunted by memories that still bled. "Torched our house with my parents and 2 younger sisters inside. I was the only survivor, and only because I was checking the cattle in the far pasture when they attacked." "No." Clara breathed, her voice barely audible. "That's not... My father wouldn't. I spent years tracking down every man who rode for your father that night." Elijah gestured toward his wall of crossed-out faces. "Each one paid for what they did to my family. But I could never reach Marcus Landry himself, too well protected, too powerful, too far above the law." He held up the photograph with trembling fingers. "You look just like her. Just like my youngest sister, Emma. She was about your age in this picture when they burned her alive." Clara's mind reeled as she tried to process this devastating revelation. Her father was capable of terrible things. She'd known that since childhood, had fled his corruption years earlier. But the systematic murder of an entire family, the kind of calculated cruelty that would burn children alive for profit. Yet looking at Elijah's ravaged expression, she knew he was telling the absolute truth. The anguish in his eyes was too raw, too genuine to be fabricated. It explained everything about him, his isolation, his arsenal, his collection of death portraits. He wasn't just a killer. He was an instrument of vengeance, systematically hunting down those who had destroyed everything he loved. I didn't know, Clara said frantically, clutching Tommy protectively. I swear to you, I had no knowledge of your family. I ran away from my father because I couldn't stomach what he was becoming. I changed my name, started over completely. Lies. Elijah snarled, though uncertainty was beginning to creep into his voice. This is all some elaborate trap. Your father sent you here to get close to me to finish what he started 10 years ago. Look at me, Clara cried, tears streaming down her face. Does this look like a trap? I'm running for my life. My husband is dead. I have nothing. I'm terrified for my son. Your husband? Elijah's eyes narrowed with sudden interest. What was his name? Daniel Harper. He was a miner in Widow's Peak until Shaw killed him in that collapse. Something in Clara's voice, the raw grief, the absolute sincerity, must have penetrated Elijah's wall of hatred because his weapon wavered slightly. But before either of them could speak again, the sound of shattering glass came from the front of the house. Shaw's men were preparing for their final assault. I will finish this later, Elijah said grimly, turning back toward the battle. But Clara could see doubt warring with vengeance in his expression, and the terrible possibility that he'd been protecting the daughter of his greatest enemy, that his quest for justice had led him to shelter the one person he should hate above all others. As bullets began flying again and flames consumed more of the house, Clara hugged Tommy close and wondered if her father's sins would finally destroy them all. The house was now burning in earnest, thick black smoke filling every room and making it nearly impossible to breathe. Clara could hear Shaw's men coordinating their final assault, knowing that time favored them. The fire would soon drive the defenders out into the open where they could be easily gunned down. Elijah moved through the infernal blaze like an avenging spirit. But Clara could see that the revelation about her identity had shaken him profoundly. His movements were less precise now, his legendary focus fractured by the war between his thirst for revenge and his growing realization that Clara might truly be innocent of her father's crimes. The flames had reached Tommy's makeshift bedroom, forcing Clara to drag her son from beneath a collapsed beam as burning debris rained down around them. Tommy was barely conscious from smoke inhalation, his small body limp in her arms as she fought her way back to the main room. Please, Clara begged, crawling after Elijah as he checked ammunition for his dwindling supply of weapons. I know what my father is. That's exactly why I left. I couldn't be part of his world of violence and corruption anymore. Then why didn't you turn him in? Elijah demanded, spinning to face her with wild eyes. If you knew he was capable of murder, why didn't you go to the authorities? Because there are no authorities, Clara cried, coughing violently from the smoke. Not for men like my father. He owns judges, sheriffs, politicians, anyone with the power to stop him. I was just a frightened girl who would have been found dead in an alley if I'd tried to expose him. The truth of her words seemed to strike Elijah like a physical blow. He'd spent 10 years believing that Marcus Landry's entire family was as corrupt and ruthless as the man himself. But Clara's obvious terror and desperation told a different story entirely. A burning beam crashed down from the ceiling, barely missing Tommy's head, as Clara shielded him with her own body. They had only minutes before the entire structure collapsed, trapping them in a fiery tomb. We have to get out of here, Clara gasped urgently. No, Elijah replied, reloading his rifle with mechanical precision, even as flames licked at his boots. The moment we step outside, Shaw's men will cut us down like dogs. Our only chance is to make them come to us and take as many with us as we can. As if summoned by his words, the front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and flame. Shaw's men poured through the opening, guns blazing, but Elijah was ready for them. His first shot dropped the lead attacker, his second sent another man screaming back into the night. But more kept coming, an endless stream of killers drawn by the promise of Shaw's blood money. Through the smoke and chaos, Clara glimpsed Shaw himself entering the burning house. He was a big man, brutal and scarred, with the cold eyes of a predator who had never known mercy. His gaze swept the infernal scene until it found Clara cowering behind overturned furniture with Tommy in her arms. "There you are, you little witch," Shaw snarled, raising his gun with deliberate cruelty. "You've caused me considerable trouble, but it ends tonight." Before he could fire, Elijah appeared out of the smoke like an avenging angel, tackling Shaw to the ground. The two men rolled across the burning floor, each trying to gain a killing grip on the other, while flames consumed everything around them. Clara watched in horror as they crashed through the weakened wall into what remained of the kitchen. More of Shaw's men were pouring into the house, now spreading out to search for Clara and Tommy, while avoiding the worst of the fire. Realizing that hiding was no longer possible, Clara made a desperate decision. She grabbed a burning piece of wood and hurled it at the nearest gunman, setting his clothes ablaze, and giving her the distraction she needed to run toward the back of the house with Tommy in her arms. But escape proved impossible. The rear exit was completely blocked by fallen debris, and the windows were too high to reach while carrying Tommy. Clara found herself trapped in what had been Elijah's bedroom, with Shaw's men closing in from behind and flames advancing from all sides. Through the smoke, she could hear the sounds of Elijah and Shaw's brutal fight continuing, furniture crashing, men cursing and grunting with pain, and the occasional gunshot. But she couldn't tell who was winning or if either would survive. Tommy was unconscious now, overcome by smoke inhalation. Clara held him against her chest, singing softly, as she had when he was a baby, trying to keep him alive with her love, even as their world burned around them. If these were to be their final moments, she wanted them filled with tenderness rather than terror. A gunshot rang out from the kitchen, followed by an ominous silence that made Clara's heart stop. She held her breath, waiting to see who would emerge from the inferno. When a figure finally appeared in the doorway, her heart plummeted. It was Shaw, bloody and battered, but very much alive. His clothes were torn and singed, he was limping badly, but his gun was steady in his hand, and his eyes burned with a promise of violence. "Well, well," he said with a cruel smile that split his burned face. "Looks like your protector wasn't quite as tough as his reputation suggested." Clara couldn't see Elijah anywhere. The terrible possibility that he was dead, killed trying to protect her, despite his hatred for her father, made her sick with guilt and grief. "Please," she whispered, clutching Tommy tighter. "Take me if you want revenge, but let my son go. He's just an innocent child." Shaw's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass in the burning room. "Oh, I'm taking you both, don't worry about that. But first, I want you to understand something about your dear departed protector." He pulled a photograph from his coat, the same image that had fallen from Clara's locket, and held it up so she could see it clearly. "You want to know why Ford was so interested in this picture? It's because I'm the one your daddy hired to kill his family 10 years ago." The words hit Clara like a sledgehammer. Shaw continued with malicious pleasure. "That's right, sweetheart. Your father, Marcus Landry, paid me good money to clear out the Ford family when they wouldn't sell their land. I'm the one who torched their house, the one who made sure none of them lived to cause trouble." Shaw pulled out his gun and caressed it lovingly. "Matter of fact, this is the same pistol I used to put a bullet in Ford's little sister's head when she tried to run from the burning house. Screamed, just like you're going to scream." Clara felt the world collapsing around her as the full magnitude of the betrayal became clear. Her father hadn't just ordered the murder of Elijah's family, he'd hired Shaw to do it. The same man who had killed her husband, who was now trying to kill her son, had been in Marcus Landry's employ 10 years ago. "It's poetic, really," Shaw said, raising his gun toward Tommy. I'll use the same weapon that killed Ford's sister to put down Landry's grandson. Your daddy will be so proud when I tell him how his little girl died screaming." That was when something inside Clara snapped completely. The rage that had been building since Daniel's death, since Shaw had threatened her son, since she'd learned the full scope of her father's crimes, finally exploded with volcanic force. With a scream that was equal parts fury and despair, Clara threw herself at Shaw just as he pulled the trigger. The bullet meant for Tommy caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around, but she didn't stop. She crashed into Shaw with every ounce of strength she possessed, knocking his gun from his hand. Shaw was bigger and stronger, but he was badly wounded from his fight with Elijah. They rolled across the burning floor, Clara fighting with the ferocity of a mother protecting her child. She clawed at his eyes, bit his hands, fought with a savagery she never knew she possessed. Shaw's hands closed around her throat, cutting off her air supply. Through her fading vision, Clara could see Tommy lying unconscious near the spreading flames. She knew that if she died, her son would die with her. Just as darkness began closing in around her vision, she felt Shaw's grip suddenly loosen. Behind him, Elijah had emerged from the kitchen like a ghost, blood streaming from multiple wounds, but his eyes burning with the fire of vengeance. He put 2 bullets into Shaw's back, sending the gang leader toppling forward, but Shaw wasn't finished. With his dying breath, he rolled toward his fallen pistol, his hand closing around the grip. "If I'm dying," he gasped, raising the weapon toward Tommy, "the boy dies with me." Clara moved without thinking, throwing herself between Shaw and her son just as the gun discharged. The bullet meant for Tommy caught her in the chest, but it was Shaw's final act. Elijah's knife found its mark a split second later, ending the gang leader's reign of terror forever. As Shaw's blood mixed with the flames consuming the floor, Clara collapsed beside Tommy, her own life ebbing away. But she could hear the most beautiful sound in the world, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at tremendous speed, accompanied by shouting voices that didn't belong to Shaw's gang. "U.S. Marshal," a voice called out through the smoke. "Drop your weapons and come out with your hands visible." The federal lawmen had finally arrived, drawn by reports from other survivors who had escaped Widow's Peak and followed the smoke of the burning ranch across the desert. The remaining members of Shaw's gang, caught off guard and demoralized by their leader's death, surrendered quickly when faced with professional lawmen. As marshals helped Clara and Tommy from the burning house, she learned that their salvation had come from an unexpected source. A miner named Peterson, who had also overheard Shaw's conversation about cutting safety measures, had escaped Widow's Peak the same night as Clara and made his way to the territorial capital. His testimony, combined with evidence gathered from other survivors, had finally prompted federal action against Shaw's criminal organization. The journey to the nearest town took 4 agonizing days, with Clara drifting in and out of consciousness in the back of a medical wagon. Tommy recovered quickly once they reached clean air and proper medical care. But the cheerful, trusting child had been replaced by a boy who watched the world with wary eyes. Clara's own wounds were serious, but not fatal. What caused her the most anguish was the uncertainty about Elijah's condition. The man who had saved their lives was fighting for his own, hovering between life and death, while the local doctor did everything in his power to keep him alive. On the 5th day, Elijah finally opened his eyes. Clara was sitting beside his bed, having refused to leave despite her own injuries, when she heard him whisper her name. "You're alive," she said, tears streaming down her face as she took his bandaged hand. "Thank God you're going to be all right." Elijah looked around the small room, his eyes focusing slowly on Clara's face. "Tommy, he's fine, playing outside with some of the other children. The marshals arrested Shaw's surviving men, and Tommy was brave enough to testify about what Shaw did to his father." Elijah closed his eyes, and Clara could see him struggling to piece together the fragmented memories of their ordeal. When he opened them again, his gaze was clearer, but filled with profound sadness. "I remember what Shaw said," he whispered. About your father hiring him to kill my family, about using the same gun. Clara nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. I also remember what you did. Elijah continued quietly. You threw yourself between Shaw and your boy. You were willing to die to protect him, just like my parents died protecting my sisters. Any mother would have done the same. No, Elijah said with absolute certainty. Not every mother, and certainly not Marcus Landry's daughter if she were truly like him. You're nothing like your father, Clara. You're everything he isn't. Over the following weeks, as Elijah slowly recovered his strength, Clara received regular visits from the federal marshals building their case against Marcus Landry. They had gathered overwhelming evidence of his criminal activities, but they needed Clara's testimony to tie everything together. Your father's empire is crumbling, Marshal Stevens told her during one visit. Shaw's men are talking, trying to save their own necks. But your testimony about the mine collapse and your father's involvement would seal the case completely. Clara knew what she had to do, but she also knew it would mean facing her father for the first time in years, confronting the man whose greed had destroyed so many lives, including her own. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Word of Shaw's death and Clara's survival had reached Marcus Landry, and he arrived in town with an army of hired guns and high-priced lawyers demanding custody of his grandson and threatening legal action against anyone who stood in his way. Clara met him on the main street of the town with Tommy beside her, and Elijah still pale and bandaged, but determined to be there at her back. Behind them stood the federal marshals ready to make arrests if necessary. A crowd had gathered to witness the confrontation, drawn by rumors of the powerful man who had finally met his match. Marcus Landry was exactly as Clara remembered from her nightmares, tall, imposing, with silver hair and cold eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they saw. Age had added lines of cruelty around his mouth that hadn't been there when Clara was a child, and his presence radiated the kind of power that came from years of unopposed brutality. Clara, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. You've caused considerable trouble with your hysterical accusations. It's time to come home and put an end to this nonsense. I am home, Clara replied quietly, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. I have been for years. Don't be ridiculous. You're my daughter, and this boy is my grandson. You belong with family, not with these strangers. You destroyed his family, Clara said, gesturing toward Elijah. You hired Shaw to murder the Ford family parents, and children burned alive because they wouldn't sell you their land. You're not family. You're a monster. Marcus's facade of paternal concern slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath. I did what was necessary to protect my business interests. The Fords were obstacles to progress, nothing more. They were human beings. Clara shot back, her voice rising with righteous anger. Just like Daniel Harper and all those other miners you killed to save money on safety equipment. You have no proof of any of these wild accusations, Marcus said, but Clara could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He was beginning to realize that his daughter was no longer the frightened girl who had fled his house years earlier. Actually, I have all the proof I need, Clara replied, reaching into her coat to pull out a thick envelope. Inside were copies of all the documents she'd given to the federal marshals, along with sworn statements from Shaw's surviving gang members detailing their work for Marcus Landry over the years. Shaw kept very detailed records of his business dealings. Clara continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Including receipts for services rendered to Marcus Landry. The raid on the Ford ranch, the sabotage of safety equipment at the mines, the intimidation of witnesses, it's all documented. Marcus's face went white as he realized the magnitude of what his daughter possessed. You wouldn't dare turn those over to the authorities, he whispered. I'm your father. You stopped being my father the day you chose money over human life, Clara replied. I already have turned them over. The marshals have everything. As if summoned by her words, the federal marshal stepped forward. Marcus Landry, the lead marshal announced, in a voice that carried across the crowded street. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder racketeering and violation of federal mining safety laws. Clara watched as her father was placed in chains, his empire of corruption finally crumbling around him. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only profound relief that the cycle of violence had finally been broken. But there was one final surprise waiting. As the marshals led Marcus away, Elijah stepped forward and did something completely unexpected. He pulled a small pistol from his coat. Clara recognized it as his personal sidearm and offered it to her, grip first. What's this for? Clara asked, confused. Protection, Elijah said simply. You're going to need it in your new line of work. That was when Marshal Stevens approached with an offer that would change Clara's life forever. The territorial governor is impressed by your courage in exposing this corruption, he said. He's offering you a position as a federal witness coordinator, helping other victims find justice and break up criminal organizations like your father's. Clara looked at the gun in her hands, then at Elijah's scarred but hopeful face, then at Tommy playing nearby with other children who had found safety and peace. She realized that this was her chance to turn all the pain and loss into something meaningful to help other families avoid the fate that had befallen the Fords and so many others. I'll do it, she said without hesitation. But I have conditions. Tommy comes with me whenever possible, and I want Elijah as my security consultant. Think he'd be interested? Stevens asked, looking at the former rancher. Elijah nodded slowly, and for the first time since Clara had known him, she saw something that might have been peace in his weathered features. Maybe it's time I used my particular skills for something constructive instead of just destructive. 6 months later, Clara stood on the porch of the small house Tommy and Elijah had built together on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, just 4 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs, purchased with the reward money the federal government had paid for her testimony. Marcus Landry had been sentenced to life in federal prison, his vast fortune seized and distributed to the families of his victims. Clara had taken nothing for herself beyond what was necessary to build their new life together. Tommy was thriving in his new environment. He attended the local school, had made friends with other children, and was slowly recovering from the trauma of their ordeal. The nightmares were becoming less frequent, and Clara could see glimmers of his old cheerful personality returning. But the biggest change was in their unconventional family structure. Elijah had become the father Tommy had lost, teaching the boy skills like hunting and tracking, while also helping him with his schoolwork. In return, Tommy's innocent affection had helped heal wounds in Elijah's heart that he thought would never mend. Their first case as federal witness coordinators had been a complete success. They'd helped a young woman named Sarah testify against a corrupt judge who had been taking bribes to dismiss charges against violent criminals. Seeing Sarah's relief when justice was finally served had convinced Clara that she'd chosen the right path. One evening, as they sat watching Tommy play in their small garden, Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out a familiar object wrapped in cloth. Found this in the ranch ruins, he said quietly, placing it in Clara's hands. Clara unwrapped the cloth and gasped. It was her locket, dented and blackened by smoke, but miraculously intact. The photograph inside was damaged, but still recognizable, herself as a child standing beside her father in what seemed like another lifetime. Thought you might want it back, Elijah said. Clara looked at the image for a long moment, remembering the frightened girl who had fled her father's house so many years ago. That girl had been running from her past, desperate to escape the legacy of violence and corruption that defined her family name. But Clara Harper, the woman she had chosen to become, was no longer running. She had faced her past, confronted her father's crimes, and emerged stronger for the experience. Without hesitation, she walked to their cooking fire and tossed the locket into the flames. "Some things are better left in the past," she said simply. Elijah nodded, understanding completely. They both watched as the fire consumed the last physical link to Clara's old life, along with all the pain and shame it represented. "What happens now?" Clara asked. "Now we build something better." Elijah replied, his arm encircling her shoulders. "Something worthy of all the people who didn't make it this far." As the sun set over their peaceful valley, Clara felt a sense of completion she had never expected to find. The cycle of violence that had claimed so many lives was finally broken. Her father would spend his remaining days in prison. Shaw and his gang were dead or scattered, and she, Tommy, and Elijah were free to build whatever kind of future they chose. The woman who had once screamed desperately for help on a wooden floor had found not just salvation, but purpose. The man who had read her terrible secret had learned that redemption was possible, even for those who thought themselves beyond forgiveness. And together, they would make sure that other desperate voices crying out for help would always find an answer. In the distance, church bells rang across the valley, their sound carrying on the desert wind like a promise of justice for all those who had been silenced by greed and corruption. Clara closed her eyes and listened, holding her chosen family close, knowing that their story, built from ashes and tragedy, had become something beautiful and strong. The secrets had been revealed, the debts of the past had been paid, and most importantly, love had triumphed over hatred. Their new life together was proof that even in the harshest wilderness, hope could take root and flourish.